Is geskakel op GROOTplaas en ons gas saam met ons in die ateljee vanoggend is Gerber, sy is die tegniese bemarker by Barenbrug en ons gesels 'n bietjie oor dekgewasse in wisselboustelsels. Jamie, good morning, welcome.
Thank you, Dippy.
So nice to have you. So, can you briefly explain why crop rotation plays such an essential role in limiting soil-borne diseases?
Yeah, it's a good question.
It's quite a
Dippy.
mouthful.
It is rather. Yeah, so cover cropping, the fundamental principle is that it's there for the soil, right? And that can be either for soil health or soil fertility or for these soil-borne pathogens. And it's quite nice. There's a lot of research out there on what different cover crops play, which roles in exactly that, looking at plant-borne, soil-borne diseases. And nematodes are quite a big issue in a lot of soils, especially in potato rotations or vegetable rotations. And in our portfolio, we've got something that we call biofumigation. And it's to use these cover crops to kind of fumigate your soils against specific nematodes. Some are more potent against specific nematodes, so your root knot or your cyst nematodes. Yeah, and there's a lot of research against which ones are for that. So you can kind of build your own cover crop to try and combat your specific nematode or issue. With the biofumigation, so for example, mustard is pretty potent. You can imagine the taste of mustard. And you grow your mustard as a cover crop. You can do it as a pure stand, and then you incorporate it back into the soil. And then incorporating back into the soil and kind of breaking down the material of the mustard is what releases this biofumigant substance, if I can say, that kind of gets rid of some of your nematodes.
So you've been saying the word nematodes quite often. Can we break that down a little bit? Because I don't think it's a bunch of little small toads, right, running around in your crop.
No, it's not. But it is microscopic organisms, and you get good and you get bad nematodes. And that's a bit of the issue as well, is because if you're trying to fumigate against nematodes, you might end up also getting rid of your good nematodes. But they're unsegmented microscopic organisms that can damage some of the rooting or the base of your plants, and that in turn affects their ability to uptake nutrients and grow optimally.
So what would be the best way of testing your soil and knowing what exactly is needed to put back in?
So that's also very important what you've touched on, is it's so important to take soil samples, to kind of let your soils dictate what you need to do with them. And there's really good labs out there. I know NemLab, if I can name one, they test your soils for exactly which nematodes you have. And then from there, you can see what you want to focus on and which ones is your biggest problem. And yeah.
So would that be something that you would test seasonally, once a year at least, or is that a once-off process?
No, in farming, nothing's once-off, I guess. If I'm correct in saying you want to test after each crop, so before you put in your next rotation. Yeah, because then you can test if you've kind of reduced the population a bit, and now this one is a specific issue, and then your next cover crop, you kind of try and combat that specific nematode population.
So when we talk about regenerative farming practices, it's gaining a lot of traction in South Africa. Why has it been picking up so quickly?
I don't know if I'm wrong in saying that this new generation that's kind of taking over.
The younger farmers.
Yes, yeah. We're all kind of focusing on exactly that and looking after the environment, and regenerative agriculture really is the way forward, because you're almost farming with nature and not against it. And if we do it with nature, it's a win-win, you know. Yeah, and with regenerative agriculture, those 5 principles that everyone speaks about, with cover cropping, you're kind of combating 3, if not 4, of those principles, or ticking off those boxes. And it's a holistic way of managing a farm. And then, yeah.
So greater plant diversity influences the soil microbes. Why is this critical for the health of the ecosystem?
So an ecosystem is obviously made up of so many different organisms and components. And your plant diversity then helps you have touch points with each of those components, right? And in cover cropping, we look at different families for diversity, and then in those families you can look at different species. And the reason we like to include each of those families, for example, your grasses or a cereal, your legumes, your brassicas, and maybe a herb, is because they each contribute different things into the soil and in the ecosystem. So your grasses have a really fibrous root system, for example. So they're kind of touching the higher portion of your soil profile. Your brassicas have a deeper taproot, so they're accessing further down, preventing anything from being leaching or reducing anything from being leached and bringing it back up to the surface. And then naturally, your different plants are different hosts for different insects and that. So, yeah, you're kind of helping everyone in the ecosystem.
So we've discussed selecting the correct cover crop species, but for a specific soil type, should we also be looking at where we are farming? Is there specific how can I say, cover crops that we should use in different climate areas of South Africa?
Yes, for sure. And I think a big one is rainfall, because a lot of cover cropping is done dry land. You know, you don't want to invest so much if you're not getting a cash crop back. So your rainfall, and there's species that can take a really low rainfall. Although with that being said, you always need water to establish a crop, you know, but you can time that pretty well with the season, touch wood. But also your soil type plays a role. And with being in different locations in the country, for example, you have different challenges that you're going to want to try and get rid of. So it might be compaction, and then you look at more brassicas with the big tubers and deep taproots to break surface compaction or lower levels of compaction. If your issue is too much water, for example, maybe you want to go with a higher yielding crop to kind of absorb as much moisture as you can. Very sandy soils tend to leach a lot more. So you want to put something in that'll scavenge a bit more and prevent as much leaching as possible. But yeah, and your different climates, for example, in Cape Town or the Western Cape, they have winter rainfall. Yeah. So you've got almost a much bigger portfolio to look at, or catalogue of cover crops to use, because you're not restricted with water.
Jamie, we're going to continue the conversation in a little bit. Ons gas in die ateljee, Jamie Gerber, en ons gesels 'n bietjie oor dekgewasse en wisselboustelsels. Ons is terug net hierna. Is ingeskakel op GROOTplaas. Ons gas saam met ons in die ateljee vanoggend, Jamie Gerber, sy's 'n tegniese bemarker by Barenbrug. En ons gesels 'n bietjie oor dekgewasse. So Jamie, just before we went on a short break, we spoke about choosing the right cover crops for your soil type and your climate. But in the article that you wrote recently, you also discuss ideal carbon to nitrogen ratios. So what would that ratio be, and how do we go about measuring that?
Yeah, so we like to speak about having enough nitrogen in the soil or enough carbon in the soil to sustain that microbial life. But that balance between the two is really important, because the balance affects how your microbes work, and we want them to work optimally. And that ratio is about 24:1, carbon to nitrogen. And I think the reason for that is because your microbes need 12 carbon for maintenance and energy, and the rest is for production, if I'm right in saying that. And certain crops are higher in nitrogen than others, and certain are higher in carbon. And as a rule of thumb, your really green or lush crops are higher in nitrogen, so they break down a lot quicker, as you could imagine. And your more yellowed or older or fibrous crops tend to be higher in carbon, so they break down a lot slower. And we use that kind of as a benchmark with formulating a cover crop, because you want that balance, as I said. So if your follow-up crop, for example, is soya beans, which is a legume, so it fixes its own nitrogen, and it'll break down a lot quicker, you want to proceed with a cover crop that's got a bit of a higher carbon content. So you'd end up putting a higher proportion of your cereals, so like your stooning rice or oats or your grasses, still keeping in that legume component for diversity, and because it's then still fixing nitrogen in the soil, but you're upping your carbon side. For example, if you've had maize before and the maize has come off, there's a lot of residual left behind, and that residual is it's aged maize, for example, and it is a higher carbon content, so it's going to break down a lot slower. So your follow-up cover crop is generally probably 60% legume and then 40% grasses or brassicas, just to try and help that the microbes in that soil to break down that maize residual.
So how does planting density influence the success of these nematodes that you've mentioned and controlling cover crops for this, or using cover crops to control this purpose?
Yeah, so your planting density does affect your yield. To a degree, you kind of plateau at a point where there's too much seed that it actually does the reverse effect. So a lot of marketers, if they suggest a cover crop to you, it's kind of worked out already what the ideal density or sowing rate is, and your rainfall or moisture content will play a role in that. If you've got a lot of moisture available, you can go a pretty high seeding rate and get a high density of plant material. Otherwise, you want to bring it down because, yeah, you're a bit restricted with your moisture, so you don't want to invest a lot in your seed costs and then not get the money back. But with, for example, as I said earlier, with the mustard, the more material you have, the more fumigation you'll get out of it when you incorporate it back into the soil. And there you're not really looking for the highest yield in terms of height-wise. So the more population you have, it's all in the plant already. So yeah, you can go on a higher seeding rate.
So when it comes to cover crops, how do they help provide a more balanced diet when it comes to livestock? When producers use crop residues in winter feeding?
So the crop residues, it's normally from maize, leftover maize, and there'll be a bit of cobs lying around and the stalks naturally, and it's a higher energy diet. It's a bit brown and yellow. There's not much nitrogen in it, so not much protein in it. And in that article, I spoke about using your ryegrasses, and your ryegrasses are an exceptionally high crude protein content. In a grass, it's about 20 to 26% crude protein, and protein is very expensive to supplement, as you can imagine. So if you can get it from a grass, it's a win. And putting in this ryegrass, for example, or any grass, a green lush grass or a legume, it complements your maize stovers really well because you get the protein from your grass and then your energy and the bulk from your maize stovers. With that being said, ryegrass, for example, has a higher water requirement. We like to say it's like a Ferrari. It runs on nitrous, not diesel, you know. What you put in is what you get out. But yeah, then it just gives a nice mixed diet for your grazing cattle, and it gives them the extra bulk.
So let's quickly just summarize. We've got about 45 seconds. If you could give all our viewers watching this morning a little bit of a head start, what would you tell them? What would the advice be?
The advice would be to choose the right cover crop. You know, we're very lucky that we don't do set mixes because we want to make it specific to every farmer. And for that reason, every farmer is special, believe it or not. And yeah, kind of see what your needs are. And then we just do what you need. And you plant what you need, and you don't plant for the sake of it. Plant something to perform a purpose. That way you save money, you combat your issues specifically, and you'll see the rewards a lot quicker, hopefully.
Fantastic.
And cheaper.
Jamie, thank you so much for being here this morning. We appreciate it. Dis Jamie Gerber, sy's 'n tegniese bemarking by Barenbrug en ons het 'n bietjie gesels oor 'n dekgewasse wanneer dit kom by wisselboustelsels. Dit is GROOTplaas vir vanoggend. Ons hoop jy het lekker saam met ons gekuier en dan is ons weer môreoggend terug, selfde tyd, selfde plek.